So thank you for having me. My name is Grant MacDonald, and I'm a postdoctoral researcher at Durham University. And I'll be talking about some work in progress, a project that's happening at Durham with Stuart James and Chris Stokes there, as well as Peter Fretwell and Stephanie. Peter is at British Antarctic Survey. Actually, if you've seen a new book in the bookshops called The Penguin Book of Penguins, that's by Peter and his wife. The instructions for this talk said if your topic is not northeastern, please mention your link to the northeast. So I was hoping this picture of me with Captain Keegan in the 90s would have northeastern emphasis. So as well as growing up here, I work at Durham University, as I mentioned too. And sometimes people ask me how I ended up working with penguins, so I just thought I'd mention that quickly. So after going to school here, I went to Kenton, I went off to uni and studied geography and got into researching ice. The picture of me on the left is doing fieldwork in Greenland. I got really interested in glaciers. Ended up doing fieldwork in the Chilean Andes to do with glaciers and climate change. And then I went to Chicago to do a PhD. When I was in Chicago, I had the privilege of being part of the US Antarctic program. I went down to Antarctica a few times to do research on ice shelves and climate change. The picture on the right was one of my greatest moments, wearing a Newcastle shirt on an ice shelf in Antarctica playing football. It's part of our project recreating some of the old Shackleton pictures. It's Mount Erebus in the background. And that was my first experience encountering penguins. We got to see lots of the delis when we were down there hanging around near the base at McMurdo. And now I've transitioned from that research of glaciers and sea ice into investigating how glacier and sea ice change are impacting emperor penguins, working with quite a multidisciplinary team. And why emperor penguins? Well, of course, they're an iconic species. I mean, just look at them, of course they are. They're a key indicator species for climate change. They're the canary in the coal mine. They're right on the front lines of climate change in the southern hemisphere. And another big motivating factor behind our research is the efforts to designate them as a specially protected species have previously been vetoed due to arguments about a perceived level of scientific understanding. Now, I think we'd argue that there is enough understanding to designate them as specially protected. We have to remember too that emperor penguins weren't even seen by humans until less than two centuries ago. And given their accessible nature, there's a lot left to be understood about them. Now just quickly, emperor penguins live on sea ice, so I just want to be very clear about what that is. So in the middle of this picture you've got the Antarctic continent with the Antarctic ice sheet on it. And kind of around that you see this ice that's sort of a different shade. That's sea ice, it's thinner than the ice sheet. It's on the top of the ocean, it's more ephemeral, comes and goes. It's a part of its normal cycle to melt and break up. And that's what the emperor penguins live on, right at the edge of the continent. They live on what we call fast ice, so that's the sea ice that's fastened to the land in the ice sheet. So in the background you've got a big ice cliff, which is the edge of the ice sheet, where you've got ice shelves and glaciers, and then they like to be on that sea ice right next to it, so they're sort of protected and sheltered. They occupy fast ice all around the continent. There's 66 colonies, we think. We think we've almost found them all. We've been finding them right up until recent years. And they need that fast ice to be stable until the end of December for successful breeding. So they lay their eggs in the Antarctic winter, so our summer. And then at the end of December, roughly, the chicks fledge and go out to sea. But they need to be ready to be in the water. So they need that ice to be stable till the end of December so that the waterproof feathers are ready for them. If that breaks up earlier, that's not good for the penguins. And they're on the very edge of their possible habitat. There's nowhere, if the climate warms, they can't just shift north or south. That's the edge. Nowhere to go. Now, you've all heard about climate change, of course, but until actually as recently as 2016, we thought the Antarctic sea ice was actually looking quite stable. It wasn't being affected too much by climate change. There was actually a slight possible growth for various complicated reasons. But actually, that sort of hope that we had for a bit has gone quite dramatically in recent years. Since 2016, Antarctic sea ice has like absolutely crashed. We've had the records be broken and broken again in recent years. You can't really appreciate the starkness from here, but this is just so last week. The orange line shows where the sea ice would normally be last week, and the kind of bright area shows that it's not reaching that level. And then this blue line is Antarctic sea ice extent this year, compared to what it normally has been, and it's been worse in other years. This year is not a record year, but it's still much worse than is typical. So we're quite worried about Antarctic sea ice, and there's a lot of talk that it's entered a new state. Antarctic sea ice decline threatens penguins massively. This image has come out a bit fuzzy for some reason, but if you see those kinds of shards, that's what sea ice can look like when it breaks up. And if you're a chick that's not ready to swim, that's not a good situation to be in. There's people who work on modelling these things and what it means for the future. Under a kind of business as usual warming scenario, so if we just keep emitting carbon as we have been, it's projected that over 90% of colonies could be quasi-extinct by just the end of this century. So not very nice for them. As well as sea ice change, the glaciers are also changing their behaviour as it warms, and you may have seen these events in the news where you get big chunks of glacier breaking off, big calving events. Because the penguins live next to that, those calving events can be quite disruptive for penguins. But that's not really something that's been researched, that's something that's part of this project. Now, I mentioned, of course, penguins are very inaccessible, they're really difficult to visit. Most of the colonies have never encountered humans, ever. But luckily for us, we can see them from space. So in free satellite imagery from NASA and the European Space Agency, you can see the guano. It stands out quite nicely on the snow and the bright snow and ice. So the pixels on these images are about 10 to 30 meters, so that's free medium resolution imagery that anyone can go and look at. We can find where the penguins are, that's how many of these colonies have been discovered, and we can see them move and so on. In higher resolution imagery, so where you get like much more precise pixels, you can sometimes make out like groups of penguins, but those images are very expensive and we don't have access to them as part of this project. So basically the goal of the project at Durham that I'm working on is to take advantage of all these images that are out there. So there's been work on this imagery, but there's a lot of images that have never been taken advantage of. These images started being captured in the 70s and 80s, and most of them have never been looked at. So the goal of the project is to use all the images, to go through the 4 decades of imagery to look at how have past sea ice and glacier margin changes impacted the colonies in the past. How do the colonies respond to past changes? So, you know, even without climate change, there'll still be natural variability that we can learn from. How resilient are the colonies to sea ice disruption events? And how will the colonies be impacted in the future if ice break carbon increases? So to really understand the future of penguins in a changing climate, we really need to understand much better how they've changed in the past. So just as a quick example of an example colony I've looked at, here you have a glacier tongue, so that you have a bit of glacier sticking out from the Antarctic continent, and this red spot is where a colony was. This is back in the 80s, second of January 1989, so this is an old image by satellite standards. And as the glacier moves, the penguins kind of follow the glacier out. And then in 2010, a big chunk of that glacier broke off, and the colony for 1 year just didn't turn up. We don't know what happened, they weren't there. And then the next year, they came back to the area, but they chose a different spot. And a few years later, they seemed like they were kind of sampling different spots, so they returned to that new spot, but they also tried a sort of spot back in that was analogous to their original one. And then eventually they abandoned the new spot and went back to the original one. So this is interesting, so we don't really know how they would respond to such an event. And these kinds of things could be happening more in the future. So that's just one colony. We've got a lot more to look through. Another thing that satellite imagery allows us to do is look through a season. So we looked at changes through time, through different years. But in recent years, satellite images are collecting very regularly, especially in the kind of last 10 years. We've got multiple platforms out at the same time from NASA and the European Space Agency. So we can see how they change through the summer. We can't look at them with these images through the winter because Antarctica is dark through the winter. But from the kind of very end of August to sort of late March, early April, depending on the colony, we can get images. So this is an example of what they look like from space. I'll just wait for it to start again. So this is August, September. See this dark patch here? That's the colony moving and spreading up. You can see it kind of smearing out. And that's the colony walking towards the sea ice edge. So that's the chicks, as they develop, will be getting ready to go off to sea, and there'll also be adults going out to hunt and bringing back food. By the sort of November, December, most of that staying will be chicks. But they have to start fending for themselves. So we're particularly interested too when we see the ice break up, when that smear is there. Here's just another example of that. So this is the edge of that glacier we were looking at before. You can see them here. You'll notice they tend to be quite packed together in August, September. When it's cold, they'll all be close together. And then as it gets warmer, they start spreading out. The chicks are also getting more mobile as they develop. And I'll just let that run through again. So you can see they like to be tucked in next to the glacier. This is an iceberg as well. It's giving them some nice shelter. You can see the sea ice breaking up, coming in, breaking up, and then So that's what the sea ice breakup looks like. And that occasion, though, the sea ice broke up in January, so that's okay for them. They should have been fine. And the sea ice forms again later in the spring when they return. So basically, as part of this, we're putting together those photos of them during the summer and of the winter to be able to try and track the colonies through a whole year. So I've spent a lot of time looking at a lot of pictures. So a lot of this has actually had to be done manually, so sometimes I just have to visually click where I see them, and we're getting to see the patterns throughout a year. One thing that's interesting about this colony that we don't really understand why is that they move onto the glacier. So it was typically thought that penguins only live on sea ice, because glaciers are thick, they're hard, they're steep, there's often not an obvious reason for them to want to go up there, but these do, they go up onto the glacier. So that's interesting, especially as sea ice breaks up more in the future. Maybe glaciers and ice shelves could provide a bit of a refuge. It's not going to be like a silver bullet that solves everything, but it might help them in some instances. But another thing that's interesting is they go up there even when they don't have to. We have no idea why they're going up there. Your guess is as good as mine. So we'll be interested to sort of see if we can figure out what that's about. But looking at them throughout the year allows us to see some of the negative aspects too. So this is one of those radar images, and the radar can also be used to look at the sea ice changes. This is from this Antarctic winter, so our summer a couple of months ago, and we went to see if we could find the colony in that radar. But there's not going to be a colony there because there isn't even any sea ice at this time. You see all this kind of moving around in the winter. That sea ice we would expect to be like a nice still image. It wouldn't be moving much, it should be stable. But instead you've got all this sea moving around, icebergs. The penguins, we don't think can really live there. So we'll be interested to learn more about that. And we may expect that to be happening more too. So I just want to end on, penguins are very far away from us geographically, but they are very much connected to us, I'd like to say. Like I said, they're a canary in the coal mine. The changes happening in Antarctica are distant, but we will feel the effects of it. Sea ice is very important for the climate. Glaciers are important for sea level rise, and it's so fundamental to our climate that we will feel the changes that are happening to them. And also, what we're doing is affecting them too, that they're suffering from carbon emissions all over the world. So their lives are very much connected to ours. The outlook can seem pretty miserable and bad for penguins. It can be a bit depressing work at times. And certainly there will be some changes that it's too late to prevent, but there is still a lot of room to minimize the damage to them. And there's also a lot more to understand about them. They're very interesting, curious, poorly understood creatures. So I'm very excited to look at a lot more images of penguins from space. Thank you.